Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. 2016 was considered a landmark year in U.S. politics because it was the first presidential election in which a woman won the nomination of a major political party to become president of the United States and nearly won. But women had been legally running for president well before 2016. Not talking about the 70s or the 60s with the women's rights movement, but all the way back to 1872, and this is decades before women could even legally vote. Since then, several dozen women have run for president, and almost all of them were long shots with nearly no chance of winning. But these long odds don't negate their story, and their presidential campaigns tell us a lot about the times in which they lived. In this episode, I'm talking with Richard Lim, host of This American President podcast. We look at the campaigns of four figures in particular. First, Victoria Woodhull, an 1872 candidate who ran for president even though she couldn't legally become president. Not because she was a woman, but because she was only 31 years old. She ran a brokerage firm in New York through the patronage of Cornelius Vanderbilt and was also a spiritualist, a radical communist, and possible former prostitute. But despite all this, she had a remarkable ability to reinvent herself. Second, we look at Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican from Maine and the first woman to serve in both houses of the U.S. Congress. She was a senator for 24 years. Smith was an early critic of McCarthyism and a 1964 presidential candidate who fashioned herself as the female Eisenhower. Third, we look at Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to the U.S. Congress. She was a 1972 presidential candidate and, oddly enough, a friend of George Wallace. Yes, that segregationist George Wallace. Lastly, we look at Edith Wilson, who has perhaps the most interesting story. She was a first lady who essentially acted as a de facto president following the stroke of her husband Woodrow Wilson in 1919 and acted as president until March 1921. This is a very important time in history following World War I, when Wilson wanted the League of Nations to form. Edith had perhaps more influence on U.S. politics than any woman in history, despite the fact that she didn't support the suffragist movement. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this fascinating look at history that most people wouldn't suspect existed in this discussion with Richard Lim. All right, Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm really fascinated about this topic because people always assume that the idea of women in politics, it started maybe in 2016. And of course, there's a 1984 with the vice presidential candidate, but we're on the cusp of something brand new here. But for students of history, they know that obviously women in politics isn't new. Considered British monarchical history, Queen Elizabeth, the Elizabethan age for the entire 15th century, the most powerful monarchs were women for the most part. But what gave you this idea to focus on female presidential candidates, even going back into the time before women could vote in the United States?
Well, when I was in college, I don't remember exactly when or what the circumstances were, but I remember I was at a panel. I was watching a panel talk about, I think it was civil rights and gender equality and all those kind of things. And one thing I remember, I don't remember anything else really from that panel, but the one thing I remember is that one of the women who was speaking, she was a pretty avowed feminist, and she said that her dream was to one day see a woman president being sworn in by a woman chief justice of the United States. And, the crowd, they were clapping and all that. And I thought about that for a while because, I thought, well, why is that like the standard? Is that the standard for what our country should be? And I just kind of pictured what would that be like? What would it be like if we had a female president sworn in by a female Supreme Court Chief Justice and kind of the symbolic importance of that? This was back in like 2004, 2005. So it was a while ago. And yeah, that moment kind of stuck with me and had me think about, why is it so important symbolically to have a woman president to people? And, it's not it's not a matter of whether it's right or wrong. It's something that seems to have a real hold on the consciousness of people. It's a goal, or people want that first one. And so ever since that moment, I always kind of thought about that.
Yeah, when I saw your episode on your podcast about this topic, I'm also intrigued how you did it, because you had female voice actors read some of the parts, so there's good production quality.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's new in the American sense, but it's not new in the global political sense. There's a poet, Anne Bradstreet, who wrote in the 17th century in the American colonies, and she was talking about Queen Elizabeth, and she said, "For those who say women are without reason, know 'tis slander now, but once was treason." So it's new, but it's not new. So yeah, I'm very curious from what does that mean symbolically? So let's jump right in. And there's a figure I'm very interested to hear about, and I had no idea about her before you mentioned her, and that is Victoria Woodhull, the first female to run for president in 1872. Decades before women had the right to vote, a good almost 50 years beforehand. What would prompt somebody to run for president at this time period? Could she even legally be president if in some way she won?
Right. Well, so she actually couldn't legally be president, and the reason wasn't actually necessarily because of her gender. It was because she wasn't going to be 35 on Inauguration Day if she was elected president. So, in a sense, there's still kind of a debate about, is she officially the first one to run? But I mean, she did announce, and she's generally credited as the first woman in American history to run for president. And it's very interesting because I remember hearing about her when I was in high school taking AP US history. And, you learn a little bit about the suffrage movement. And, it also says, in 1872, Victoria Woodhull ran for president. And so historically, you kind of group her with all these other suffragists, the Susan B. Anthonys and Elizabeth Stanton and all those people. And, they all kind of the image of these elder women from the Victorian age. But actually, in her background, she was nothing like them. I mean, she was, background and ideology and everything else. She was much more radical, and she came from pretty much a family of ill repute. And her father was basically the equivalent of a snake oil salesman. And he pretended to be a lawyer and gave out phony legal advice and collect the fees. He would give out quack medicine as a doctor. And he also used his kids and exploited them as to get money. And he had his kids, his wife was a spiritualist, and she was really into seances and all these things. And Victoria and her sister, Tennessee, were basically child preachers. And, they would just go, they would travel in different places in the Midwest and, East, Mid-Atlantic, and they would, have these spiritualist kind of, they would see things, visions and all that kind of stuff. And that's her background. In fact, there's even evidence, we're not really sure, but some authors think that her father basically prostituted his daughters out. So this is the background that our first woman candidate for president historically comes from. And, as soon as I started learning about her, I just thought, this is just too interesting to not have more people learn about. I mean, she was not one of those Victorian women of the suffrage era that people picture.
Yeah, there's some weird characters out there in the American frontier at this time, and I think you checked all the boxes right there: snake oil, spiritualist, all the weird esoteric religious movements. What prompted her to run based on her own words?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I think one thing is that her and her sister were also just really street smart, and they spent a big part of their young life just kind of, just doing random odd jobs and just finding really unconventional ways to make money. And then they kind of decided, what, we're into spiritualism. I heard a lot of these rich people up in New York City are into spiritualism. Let's go there and get in with those people. And they actually specifically targeted Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Cornelius Vanderbilt, the magnate, the steam and rail billionaire in today's dollars. And we don't know exactly what happened, but they Vanderbilt was the kind of guy you could literally knock on his mansion and he'd open the door. So they did that. And these two young, attractive women, they get to know him. He was already very old at that point. He was old and widowed. And somehow they convinced him to, again, it's not exactly clear, but at some point after meeting Cornelius Vanderbilt, they went from these two random girls, living, not even paycheck to paycheck, but, basically just hand and mouth. And then suddenly they own a brokerage firm in New York City. And when that happens, it made news. They were the first women in America to own a brokerage firm in New York City. I've heard different things about how they made that money, whether it was directly from Vanderbilt or, some say Vanderbilt kind of told them which stocks to invest in. And, next thing you know, they make tons of money. But then from there, they got a lot of press. The suffragists actually, they met them. They were like, these women are great because, we're fighting for the right to vote and all this stuff. But these women are actually going out there and doing the things that we want to do. They're making money. They're having their own careers and all that. And then at some point, Victoria Woodhull, she just kind of adopted that suffragist mantle. And she, I think that running for president was kind of the next big thing to do, and suddenly she's just, and she didn't, it wasn't like a party nominated her. She just decided to run. Now, later, before the election, because I think she announced in 1870, I think 1871, 1872, this group called the Equal Rights Party, who were basically these group of radicals, they got together and formally nominated her. They also nominated Frederick Douglass to be her vice presidential candidate. And again, if when you look in the history books, you just see, oh, Victoria Woodhull and Frederick Douglass, they were nominated, and you kind of think, oh, it almost lends legitimacy to it, the fact that Frederick Douglass was nominated. He's a very respected figure. But in reality, Frederick Douglass was actually campaigning for Grant. He was Republican, and he was supporting the Republican. And Douglas had never met her. Had never asked for this. Like, they just kind of tacked his name onto it to add legitimacy. But Woodhull, again, historically, they were all together in this reform movement. Not really. And I think, a lot of it was she just kind of got swept up in her fame, and she just adopted this new movement. It was really crazy. So yeah, it just seemed to be a kind of a crazy ride to fame and fortune, in a very short period of time. And I guess running for president was kind of the next step.
It's easy to knock her that, this is somebody who glommed onto fame and fell into this. Sure. But honestly, if you look at enough presidents, that's not too different from some of the presidents we've had. Harry Truman, who was a favorite son of the crony boss of Kansas City and just fell into success despite his best efforts to sabotage his own life until he fell into a Senate seat. He becomes vice president. His president dies. He becomes president, despite all reasonable expectation, does a good job. So in an alternate reality, what if President Woodhull would have been a perfectly fine president? We don't know. Could have happened.
Possible.
Do you have any sense of how much traction did her campaign get? Were newspapers writing about her? Did she do much in terms of campaigning?
Well, so the fact that she became, that her and her sister own this brokerage firm, that definitely made noise. And it's interesting because if you actually read some of the media reports at the time, some people were pretty friendly to them. There were some that basically said, these two women, they're actually doing some pretty cool things. And there was an era of reform, a spirit of reform going on. It was not too long after slavery had been abolished, during the end of the Civil War, and suffrage movement was going pretty strong. So, there were people that were open to it. The problem, is that, well, there are two things really. The first is that, her views came out, and they were a lot more radical than, the suffragists. And her views, it's interesting because she started a newspaper, it was actually a weekly with her sister, and they started putting on the Communist Manifesto, and they would, they were friends with kind of these radical leftist international labor groups, which is funny because I mean she made her money through like this capitalist, this essentially this billionaire equivalent of one at least, and they were hobnobbing with all these New York elites, but they're of course they're hanging out with all these